Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
My uncle, an over-the-road owner-operator for 30-plus years, told us, my cousins and myself, a story in the mid-1980s about a run he was driving from Nashville to Chicago, then Chicago to San Francisco, then back to Nashville, in the late 1970s. According to his story, he was driving through a desert in Nevada. It was about 10 p.m., and he had been driving for 14 or 15 hours at that point. He said that there hadn't been anything for 100 miles but sand, cactuses, and snakes. His eyelids were starting to grow heavy, so he just pulled right over on the side of the road, headed back to his sleeper, and passed out. At around 2 a.m., he was awakened to the sound of tapping outside of his cab. Thinking it might be the Highway Patrol or Department of Transportation, he hopped into his passenger seat to grab his logbook before going to see who was knocking. As he grabbed his logbook, he heard the tapping again coming from the lower glass of his driver door, followed by a child's voice saying, "Hey mister, we're thirsty and tired. Can we come inside?" He was suddenly struck with this feeling of absolute dread. He said it was so strong that he didn't even want to look to see who was speaking. Something you've got to understand about my uncle. In the entire time I'd knew him to that point, I had never seen him scared of anything. Anything. I'd seen him charge headfirst towards a guy that had drawn a gun on him. I'd seen him literally attack an alligator that had gotten too close to my cousin when we all went on vacation to Florida one year. Nothing scared the man. However, even years after this incident, as he was telling the story to us, you could see the fear in his eyes. He said that they had tapped on the glass again and asked once more to be let inside. Against his better judgment, he looked over at the glass and then just froze. He said they looked like two normal kids, if a little pale, but it was their eyes. Their eyes were solid black. He described them as seeming to have eyes, but also not have eyes, and yet felt like they were staring right through him through his lower glass. He immediately yelled out to them to leave him be. He said that they stared at him, almost angrily, for a few seconds, then just disappeared. Not like they turned away and walked off, or stepped down from his bottom step, just poof, gone. He sat in his passenger seat for a few seconds, trying to figure out what had just happened, when suddenly, they started pounding on his passenger door, right next to him, and yelling, "Let us in, now." He said they didn't sound like kids anymore. With zero hesitation, he jumped from his passenger seat to his driver's seat, threw his rig in gear, and peeled out from there as fast as he could switch gears. He said he didn't slow down until he hit California and took a different highway back to Tennessee. He did say he saw them again later on that morning, though. He said he'd been trucking down the highway for another couple of hours, when, in his lights, he saw those same two kids on the side of the road, just standing there staring at his truck. They continued to stare at him the entire time as he passed them, but were gone when he looked for them in his side mirrors. He told us he found another gear in his truck that he didn't even know he had then. Could it have been a nightmare? Not likely, since he was obviously awake when he was driving into California that morning. Could it have been a story he made up just to scare us kids? Maybe, but he wasn't really the scary story type, as well as that he told us all the same story well into our adult years. Could it have been the hallucinations of an overworked, sleep-deprived mind? Possibly, but he'd worked these hours, and had even drove this same route, for many years before and after. Also, the whole black-eyed kid phenomenon hadn't even been popularized in the mainstream yet, and wouldn't be for a couple of decades. I'll let you make your own judgment on his story.
Where I live, in North Wales, there is an expansive woods right opposite my house. One day, me and my friends went to walk my dog down there as there is a path. At the very bottom of this woods/forest, there is a giant, abandoned care home without windows. No roof. An overgrown garden. No owner. Nobody living in there, apart from birds, cats, etc. We decided to walk my dog, Trixie, just down to the entrance of the care home as my dog was afraid of it. She wouldn't walk any farther than to the driveway before she started to yelp and cry. Me and my friends were also scared as we were 15 years old. When we got to the bottom of the woods, there was a little boy with a scruffy dog. It was a German Shepherd to be precise. A great giant, shaggy dog. At first, me and my friends took no notice of it as when we had our first glance, we thought it was a woman as he had his back towards us and he had long hair. He also knelt down so it was hard to see his real size. But then my dog started to bark and then his dog started to bark. The little boy stood up, without turning to control his dog and put him on a leash, He dropped a shovel to the ground and slowly turned around to look at us. He was mumbling something, but we couldn't hear him as he was approximately 60 or 70 meters away from us. We just stood there. We didn't know what to do. My dog was practically choking herself on the leash, trying to get away. Then he looked at us, his face was pale. He had no mouth. No nose. He just had a blurry face with a pair of the deepest, darkest eyes I've ever seen. He had no pupils. Well, from what we could see, his whole eyes were pitch black, as dark as coal. It wasn't just my eyes playing tricks on me as we had a good long stare, me, my friends and him, for about 30 seconds. We all ran screaming. My dog was barking crazily. To this day she won't even step a foot in there, not even with my dad. Creepy things go on in that woods all the time. Thank goddess I'm moving shortly.
Please don't take this lightly and stay safe. Here is what happened to me 2 nights ago. I was encouraged by friends who tell me people need to know what I've experienced. I recently moved into a condo in Southeast Portland, Oregon. Outside of downtown, it's pretty rural here and there are more houses and condos than apartment complexes. I was out on my balcony smoking a cigarette when I noticed something strange. Now I'll preface this by saying I have heard of black-eyed kids, children, people, whatever. I don't usually get spooked by scary stories or creepypastas. They are all fun and games, right? No harm. I have had weird things happen to me I can't explain, don't get me wrong. My boyfriend swears I was possessed once. I had an object thrown at me by no one when I was alone in a basement. Paranormal weirdness that I don't bother much to try and understand. I dismiss it and go on with my life. I never believed I'd be writing something like this. I'm a graduate student on a professional track and I stay pretty firmly grounded in scientific and reasonable explanations, whether I know what they are or not. I favor the belief they are underlying everything. So on my balcony smoking. Across the condo complex on a neighbor's balcony I see 2 silhouettes. It's late, around 2 a.m., and it's a weeknight. One was slightly taller than the other, but they looked to be females around the age of 8 to 12 with one a bit older. I saw movement and the 2 stood close to one another. I could hear them knocking on the second-story balcony door. My light was off, so aside from my cigarette burning I don't think anyone could see me well enough to know I was there, and once I saw them I was still frozen. I don't know why, but as soon as I could make out their shapes I felt an overwhelming sense of terror. Like something imminent and dangerous was preying on me and I couldn't move. After some time, 10 minutes of paralyzing fear and listening to their knocks, the light in the condo came on and someone opened their blinds. I was afraid for them. I wanted to yell at the neighbor to stop, but I was more afraid they'd see me, and I can't explain it, but I knew I didn't want them to know I was watching. The neighbor stepped back, I think confused and apprehensive. I could understand why. I heard the voice of the older, taller one and it burned in my mind. It was completely monotone and seemed to be void of any life or cheer. Like a kid is usually happy sounding even if they aren't happy. But it was so weird. I knew it wasn't the voice of a child or a person. It wasn't human. Something in this voice was wrong. I couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but at one point the smaller one turned around and stared straight at me like she knew I was there the whole time. I almost pissed myself. Still paralyzed with fear, I couldn't move. I saw pale skin and huge black eyes. It was dark, it was far, but I know what I saw. When she turned, the light from inside the neighbor's balcony shed light on them so I could see well enough to know her eyes were pitch black. Her clothes were strange and old, outdated, and she was expressionless. The neighbor had the door open only an inch or 2 and her hand looked ready to slam it shut. The taller girl became angry and she seemed as though she was going to make her way in through the damn door. The neighbor slammed it and locked it hard. I could hear the fear of that woman with the intensity in which she locked that door. She stepped back from the door, leaving the blinds drawn, and I lost sight of her. They stood before the smaller one, looked up at the taller one. The 2 looked at each other, said nothing. No communication, and in unison looked toward me, and I broke free of my paralysis to bolt inside and lock the door. Still holding my cigarette with its filter burning at this point. I kept the light off and kept my eyes on their shadowy silhouettes. This is where it gets crazy sounding, and I search desperately for a way to say this that anyone reading can comprehend the sheer shock, terror, and seriousness at what I witnessed with my own 2 eyes. They effing dematerialized. I mean, they just turned into almost a swarm of what could have been insects and disappeared. Swear to God, in my life. I watched the spot where they had been standing for what had to be the longest 60 seconds or so of my life. and I stepped back away from the window in fear of them popping up behind me or something. I was shaking violently and my cat rubbed on my leg, meowing in some attempt to console me because he sensed my fear. I noticed my cigarette filter still on my hand was flattened from me pinching it so hard. I looked down at my cat and back outside because I wanted to try and find them. I looked where they were on the porch to see if I'd gone insane temporarily, and they were just hiding there or something. They were gone. My neighbor returned to where I could see her in her window. She was on the phone, probably with the police, and that's when I noticed them again, directly above her, on the roof. Just standing above her, holding hands. Then they got on their hands and knees. I still was completely gripped by fear and horrified by what I was seeing. Backtrack a bit. Since we moved in, we have been hearing things on the roof at night. Running back and forth, footsteps, dropping something heavy sounds, which is weird because we are on the second and top floor. We have been arguing with the neighbors who say we are making too much noise during quiet hours of 10:30 p.m. to 6 a.m., which we definitely don't. I am always sleeping due to medical school and my boyfriend stays up late but always by himself. We don't have a TV, so he just reads or looks stuff up on his phone. He doesn't stomp around or move furniture. So I always thought it was weird that it sounds like people are walking above us or running or whatever it is. I chalked it up to trees hitting the rooftop and whatnot. So these kids are on the roof somehow, don't know how they could have even gotten up there. They get on their hands and knees and are moving on top of this lady's roof. It looks like they may have been scratching at it or digging at it, but I could see their black eyes in contrast to their skin with their heads cranked up straight, watching me through the window of my balcony door. They were both looking right at me, which was extremely unnerving. I didn't even know WTF was happening or why. I knew I had to get some kind of proof of what was happening, but I was terrified to take my eyes off them and lose them from view. I knew my phone was plugged into the charger in the kitchen, and something in my head said to me, not in my voice, "Don't move, you may not like where you see me next." Like someone was talking to me in my mind. It scared me so much I felt like my heart was going to explode. I wish someone other than my cat was there so I could validate what I saw and ask them to bring me my phone so I didn't lose sight of them. But the phone is important and I must prove I'm not crazy. I broke our staring match and ran to the kitchen, just breaking the gaze eased a bit of the terror. But I was still shaking. I grabbed my phone and went back to the window. They stood up in unison. I pulled up my camera and snapped, but the flash reflected on my window and it was a shitty nothing picture. I think it upset them. I was trying to photograph them and again they started disappearing. Like I said earlier, dematerializing or something, because you could see like pieces of them all fading sporadically, lessening into them not being there at all. I continued looking at the roof, the balconies, even down below, and couldn't see anything or anyone. My neighbor was still on the phone at the door. Her husband or significant other or male roommate was there with her, and she was pointing up and talking to either him or whoever was on the phone. She pointed outside and stomped her foot. He was shaking his head in what seemed like disbelief, and she passed him the phone and left my line of sight into her condo. I wanted to go out on my balcony, but I was still very afraid. I felt wrong, sick to my stomach from the intensity of the experience. I told my boyfriend about it when he came home and he was very freaked out. He has never seen me get upset to literal tears about anything, and knows I am a die-hard skeptic of aliens, ghosts, and anything paranormal. I dismiss every photo or video as a hoax and just think with everything anyone can do technology-wise today, there has to be a reasonable explanation. It shook me to my core and I wish the story ends there. The next night I was smoking on my balcony. This was last night. It was earlier than before and this time my boyfriend was home. I felt creeped out, but okay to go out with him within scream's reach, so I was going to have a quick cigarette before bed. I was in a robe and slippers, and this time I turned my light on. I sat down and lit my cigarette with the balcony door still open. I took a long drag and exhaled and heard 2 coughs somewhere above me. Holy shit. I knew exactly what it was. I froze and a deep sense of dread boiled up, just like the night before. I threw my cigarette, and almost tripped sliding inside the open door. I locked it immediately, at which point my cat began freaking out because he hates being locked out and followed me outside. He was going bananas. Screaming pathetically and frantically, I gave in and opened the door. He bolted inside and I slid it closed and locked it again. I kept the light on and called my boyfriend over. "They are on the roof," I said, and we both got quiet. We heard footsteps above us and his eyes got big. We stood there silent and still just listening. They sounded like they were heading toward our front door. I ran over to it to double lock it using the top lock, which we always leave open. As soon as I touched it, I felt this cold, creeping, depressing sadness come over me like a wave. And there it was. Knock, knock, knock. They were waiting for me to open my door. I meekly said, "Who's there?" Timid and way less courageous sounding than I would have liked. That voice from the prior night, that dead lifeless voice, was being directed at me. "Ma'am, you have to let us in, please help us." I didn't say anything. I wished my door had a peephole, but it doesn't. So I started backing away. Knock, knock, knock. My boyfriend came up behind me and gave me his phone. He said, "We have to get a picture or no one will believe this," softly in my ear. I shook my head knowing he was right and started to approach the door again, hoping to sneak a photo through the high window to the right of the door. When I was just a few steps away, the taller one lifted her face up to the window and shook her head in a disapproving no. The blinds were mostly down, but I could see her face almost entirely with the exception of her lips and chin. Those big black eyes with absolutely no white anywhere. They were huge, like too big to be human eyes. And there was no way she could reach my window. She had to be floating there to look in, which made me really confused and scared. I had my camera up and ready and snapped the picture without flash, and when I looked at it, she wasn't in it. I'm serious. She should have been. I snapped it while she was there. She was still there after I took it, but she wasn't in the picture. I looked back at her soulless, creepy face, and she somehow smiled without smiling, like, "Ha ha, you can't prove this happened." I almost wanted to open the door and be like, "WTF are you?" And that's when it happened again, and my boyfriend saw it too. She just slowly fell apart into nothingness and vanished. The heaviness lifted and my boyfriend and I were floored. He asked if we should open the door and look. He asked if I got the picture. I gave him the phone to see for himself. He was like, "No way. What the hell? I don't know what they are, but there is a reason there are no pictures of them that are real. They can't be photographed. Does that mean they exist in another dimension? Or are they dead? Or vampires?" I never would have believed anyone if I heard my story from anyone else. If it didn't happen to me, there would be no way I'd give it the time of day. But it did happen to me, and I'm really scared it's going to keep happening, or worse. What should I do? I am so grateful to be alive, but the terror I felt around these girls really has me on edge. I am so scared of going out on my balcony, or even leaving my house at night or going to my house. It doesn't feel safe, and I have no way to legitimize what happened or do anything about it. I want answers. I want to know what they are. I want to ask them if I will see them again, but it's like I can't even speak to them. I am just almost completely immobilized. How does someone combat something like this? It's like something from a Stephen King novel, but it actually happened. I feel like they are really pissed that I tried to take pictures of them, and I don't know what is going to happen next, if anything. But I had to get it out somehow because it is real, it does exist, and it's changed everything I've ever thought about paranormal experiences. So scared. I hope they don't ever come back, but I know from hearing things at night they may be here more often than I'd like to believe, and whether I see them or not, they are there, and I have no way to prove it. Really frustrating and soul-shaking. Anyone help? Answers. Advice. What are they and what do they want? Has this happened to anyone else or something similar?
I'm a believer in many paranormal things, with black-eyed kids being one of the stories I thought was urban legend until early this morning. I'm the assistant manager of the Pizza Hut in my town, and my general manager has me on the late-night shift so he doesn't have to anymore. It was a little after 2 a.m. and around that time is when the external lights of the building cut off, leaving the parking lot almost pitch black. The driver and I were in the very back of the store finishing up dough prep and dishes as we normally do. I like to say that I am attuned to the paranormal since I have witnessed many things throughout my 21 years. While we were in a conversation about sales and what to prepare, I started to feel unnerved. I ignored it due to anxiety and stressing over a homeless man making a scene a couple hours prior to close. But the feeling didn't go away, so I made a patrol around the restaurant. I looked out of the front doors first since the highway out front gives off a little bit of light, but there was nothing. I looked out the windows in the dining room, but still nothing. It wasn't until I decided to look out the drive-through window that I saw it. Standing about 5 yards away from the window was a girl in a dress, barely illuminated by the lights that were still cooling down outside. She was pale and had hair that fell just past her shoulders. As an adult, my first thought was, what is that kid doing out in 34 degrees Fahrenheit weather in the pouring rain? But then our eyes met and I saw that hers were a jet black color. I recoiled from the window and ran over to the safe to get my phone out of it. We have to keep our phones locked up during business hours, and I don't have to have my phone glued to me 24/7, so I normally just leave it in there until I need it. By the time I got it out and ran back to the drive-thru, she wasn't there, and I didn't see her again for the entire time we were there. I know the stories say they come to the doors of homes and try to get in as long as you don't invite them, and then you're fine, but she just stood there and then vanished. I am still on edge from the whole situation. The believer of the paranormal in me also makes me wonder if it could have been a spirit, which scares me more. My first encounter with an entity was one that portrayed itself as a child, so who knows? I just had to post my story somewhere. My girlfriend thinks I'm crazy, and my general manager, who also believes in things such as this, is now freaking out.
I was 17 when this happened. At the time of writing this, I am 19 and almost 20. I was working at an indoor water park that will be referred to as the Puddle. I was a lifeguard and was the last one heading home late one night. I was soaking wet and freezing despite it being around 80 degrees out. I got into my car and locked it, pulling my phone out for some music. I read a couple messages and got distracted. Suddenly there was a tap on my window. I looked up and saw a couple of kids staring at me. I rolled the window down just enough to hear them clearly. "What's up, guys? Are you lost?" I asked in a polite tone. They didn't really respond. They didn't move at all. Finally, the smaller child spoke. And as he did, my heart dropped. The voice that came from this child's mouth was deeper than my own. It was so deep that it sounded like Satan himself spoke to me. "We just need a ride home. Could you let us in and take us there?" I couldn't move. I was frozen in fear. "Come on, mister, just open the door," it demanded, knocking again. As they were knocking, a car's headlights illuminated their faces. They had voids where their eyes should be. When they saw my look of horror, they grinned and started pounding so hard on my window that I thought it'd break. I kept trying to start my car, but it wouldn't. Finally, one of the housekeepers of the hotel the Puddle was built around came out to throw the trash away. I heard them walking and went to warn them about the kids. When I looked up, they were gone. Now, this could have been a hallucination brought on by the amount of stress I went through. But it was very real for me. Anyway, my car ended up starting and I made it home in record time. Like I said, not the scariest thing that's happened to me, but it's up there. Let's just hope they don't find me again.
I have one experience with black-eyed kids. I was on vacation with my parents a long time ago. I was still a kid myself, and it was very late at night. I had just gotten back to the hotel but wanted to go back downstairs and kill some time in the arcade and decided to take the elevator. What happened next was one of the most confusing, terrifying experiences of my life. I get in and go down, and in the elevator as it gets closer to the bottom floor I suddenly feel terror I've never felt before in my life. The feeling was so specific. The door opens and standing in front of me are two kids with huge pitch black eyes staring at me. One kid looked a bit older than the other and was taller. They were both wearing some average-looking clothes. They said nothing, but they were beyond threatening. I mean, I would have rather the door opened to someone holding a gun to my face than these creatures with the feeling they gave off. I was in shock for a second and immediately closed the door and got back up as fast as I could. My little brain was a mix of traumatized and highly confused at what happened. Needless to say, I never used the elevator alone or went into the hotel arcade late at night ever again. This happened before I even knew that other people encountered them, and didn't even have decent internet at the time. I never saw one outside of a dream ever again that usually presented itself as a young girl with long black hair and large fang-like teeth.
I'm telling this story for the first time. The only other people who know about this are my immediate family members. I know it sounds completely fabricated and I have no way to prove any of it. But it happened. I'll do my best. I'm originally from Ireland. I moved to the States roughly 20 years back. This story takes place in County Clare, Ireland, when I was about 15 years old. One afternoon I was walking through the woods near my home. I was alone. I was a loner in my youth, and I would often stroll the woods until I found a tree to sit beneath and write. Writing has always been my hobby. My point is that I was very familiar with these woods. It felt safe there. On this particular day I was walking a path to a specific tree that was my favorite to sit beneath, The sounds of the woods were all around me. There was a gentle breeze, and while I couldn't see the birds, I could hear them. It was comforting. And then it all stopped. Everything became unnaturally still. The air was still, the birds stopped twittering, I no longer heard a single thing. I had never experienced this before. It was as if I had suddenly become deaf. There was just nothing. No sound, no movement, no breeze. At this point I had started to become anxious. I wasn't yet afraid, but I started home anyway. The feeling in the woods was not what I was used to. I was no longer comforted, so I decided to go home. It was then that I saw movement from the corner of my eye. Nothing I could pinpoint, but a dark shape that was just there. And then it wasn't. Everything else was still that eerie calm. I started to walk faster, and then the black shape again. This time on my other side. Now I was afraid. I began to run. I still heard nothing, but I was sure something was chasing me. When I reached my home, I ran inside and slammed the door, fully expecting my mom to yell at me for slamming. But she wasn't there. In fact, nobody was home. That was a bit odd, but not unheard of. Finally gaining some sanity, I decided I needed tea. No. So I began to boil the water for tea. And then there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my heart rose to my throat. Nobody knocked in these parts. It was a small village where everyone knew everyone else. Everyone was family. There was no knocking. There was a friendly oi there, and then people came in, so a knock was strange. I crept over to the glass in the door and peeked out. I noticed two things right away that terrified and confused me. The first was a child. A girl of maybe 10 or 12, looking not at me but at her feet. The second thing scared me to my toes. It was getting dark. How was that possible? I had left to go on my walk at midday. The sun had been fully out, and I had been gone no longer than 40 minutes. How dark was it then? I looked at the clock. It was almost 7. How had I misplaced 5 hours? The knock came again, and I jumped again. I didn't open the door. I called out, "Oi there, can I help you?" The girl didn't look up. She said,
I need to come in. Please let me in.
She had no accent. She wasn't Irish. There was no lilt to her voice. She sounded American. I called out again, "I can't let you in, but I'll ring someone if you need help." The child still didn't look up. She said,
No, that won't work. I need to come in.
At this point I had had enough of the strange, scary child. She was freaking me out. I wanted my mum. I wanted my dad. I wanted to know where 5 hours of my life had gone, and I was so frightened at this point that not even tea was going to help. So I did what any teenage girl would do when faced with a situation such as this. I screamed and ran to my bed, covered myself with my blanket, and waited for my mum to come home. This was pre-cellular phones, and I was not going to risk going to the kitchen to phone someone. Plus, I had no idea who I would call. The girl was still knocking on the door, but she never moved to a window or to the back door. She stayed at the front door. After a while, I got my nerve up to go check again. It had been silent for a bit. I went to the door and looked out the glass. The girl was still there, but she was no longer at the door. She was sitting on the fence. She was no longer looking down. She was looking right at me, and in the fading light it looked like her eyes were pitch black. I screamed again and ran back to the safety of my blanket. Eventually my mum came home. I told her what happened. She decided that it was my overactive imagination, but she did call down to the shop and the pub to find out if anyone in town had an American family visiting, or if anyone knew who the girl was. Nobody did. My grandmother told me I had survived an encounter with the Fae and that I was lucky. She was the only one who ever believed me. I never saw the girl again. I never had missing time again. I never felt the absolute stillness in the woods again. When I got up my courage to go back. After I moved to the States and years later I heard of black-eyed children. My story seemed to coincide with that. But that's ridiculous, right? I still have no explanation. Demon. Fairy. The Fae are said to be evil and will kidnap children, and the woods was near a fairy hill. Ghost. Black-eyed child. I don't know. But it happened. I swear to that.
This happened to me in 2000, when I was 7 and my small twin brother and sister were 5 and my elder sister was 9. My mum and we 3 kids were sleeping in a big bed, and my sis was gone to watch TV in the neighbor's house. It was nighttime, so my mum just closed the door and didn't lock, thinking that my elder sis would return, but she didn't. And we all fell asleep, leaving the door closed but locked. So later that night someone cracked open the door. My mum thought it was my sis and told her to come and sleep and lock the door, but no one replied. My mum was half asleep, and as she opened her eyes she saw a small boy who was pale white and slightly bigger with black eyes. It was around 1 a.m. My mum screamed and neighbors came to our house. Actually, we were living in a flat-style building, so neighbors were just next door. And that boy just vanished in front of Mum. She told everyone, but no one believed her. The next night my neighbor auntie was outside just to take some fresh air at night, and the same guy again came and started throwing stones at her. She screamed and ran into her room. That day was a holiday and my father and her husband were at home. So my father and her husband started chasing that kid. That kid was talking in some other language. After chasing for 5 minutes or so, the kid stopped and started shouting at my uncle and dad. And just vanished in front of them. After that, they returned and got ready to sleep. After an hour that kid came again and started banging on our door. We were too afraid to open it this time. After some time he stopped. 3 days after that incident my father died. I'm 25 now and we live in Nepal. That incident took place when we used to live in India. I don't know if that thing was a supernatural being or what. I can never forget his face.
I was about 12 years old in 2008. I was laying in the bed in my parents' room. There's a window over the bed. I hear a whisper. I look out to see what I heard. I see a little girl around my age. She had long hair and an all-black silhouette. Dead dark eyes. We made eye contact. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Mind you, this is the backwoods of Mississippi. There are no lights outside our house, but an orange security light about 40 yards to her right. She was just standing in the driveway. I remembered waking up the next morning with my head still in the window. She was gone, but I've never forgotten her.
I have had a black-eyed child encounter. My mother and I were driving home right as Hurricane Sandy was starting and my mom needed to get us home. That is when we saw a boy maybe 10 and a girl maybe 7 on the sidewalk when we got into the car. We passed them off as nothing. This was a strip mall, so maybe their parents worked here. Right before we started the car, they knocked on the window. My mother cracked it open. It was clear she felt the same discomfort that I had. They told us they needed to get home, and for some reason, my mother said no. But before she could drive away, the children started reminding us of the storm, how they had no umbrellas, that they were children. My mom was reaching for the unlock button when I saw the black eyes, not like the pupil was gone but like the whole eye was black. I yelled no to my mother. The second I did, she stepped on the gas. We still talk about today.
In 2017, I was in college on break and I saw a younger girl near where I was on my own. I didn't really think much of it and I kind of wanted to be by myself, so I walked off. But she started following me. I stopped and turned around and she was just looking at the ground like she was scared, so I asked her if she was okay. She kept on asking for me to help her find her family and that she was lost. So without asking any questions I asked, "What's your name, and how old are you?" Like I would normally do, I just automatically. She was really far ahead of me when I started walking, so I put on a jog. I got near and we went around a sharp corner when I realized I was just about to go off the ground, so I stopped. I was so focused on following this girl that I hadn't even realized how far away I'd got from the college, so I shouted, "No, let's go back, it'll be okay. We can ask at reception." But she refused and I said, "No, come on, it's not safe to be about here on your own." I went to grab her hand to pull her towards the college when she looked up and her eyes were fully black, the whole eyeball. I quickly let go and jumped backwards in a gasp and she said, "Please, just help me find my parents." I was so shocked I just slowly backed away. We were near a road now, I'd walked more. That's when I realized something was wrong. I honestly thought I was gonna get hit by a car and die. Something was up, I just didn't know what. So I turned around and mumbled that I was going back. I didn't want to run away from a child. I walked as fast as I could, trying not to look too freaked out, but then I realized she was following me. It creeped me out, but I just carried on. she still followed, so I slowed down a bit and said, "Wait here." I then got really scared and started running. She started running after me and I screamed, "Stop following me." I was freaking out. I just wanted her to get away from me. I ran around that corner and thought I'd lost her, but I carried on running anyway. I wasn't willing to change it. I then bumped into a group of boys and told them, "Don't go that way, there's someone following me, get help." They just laughed and left. I stopped for a second to check what was going on and she came back from around the corner and slowly walked up to me saying, "Please just help me find my mummy. I don't want to hurt you. I just want to play games." That's when I screamed and started crying and sprinted up to reception to explain what happened. They took me to a back room and said it was going to be okay. They'd keep an eye out and I was safe. I honestly thought they believed me until I got sent home for a rest. They thought I was just losing it, and once I got home I started questioning it myself. But I know it happened. I remember it really clearly, and even one of my friends says she saw a girl looking at the floor of the break before but ignored it.
My friends always told me stories of these black-eyed children, and I never believed them. But one day, when I was home alone while my dad was at work, I heard a knock. I went to look through the eye hole, I guess you would call it, and saw a little girl, who looked to be 12, and an older boy, 15 I want to say. I answered the door to see them both wearing sunglasses and black hats, what looked like they were hiding their faces. I asked them what they wanted, and they said water. I closed and locked the door, went to get water, and brought it to them. When I opened the door again, they looked at me, both were missing hats, which I was almost sure they were wearing earlier. I didn't really question it, and gave them the water. I then again asked what they wanted, and they both, in unison, replied, "Help." I asked why they needed help, and they inched towards me, so I backed away, still guarding the doorway. They said let us in. I was kind of creeped out, so I told them no. They asked again, with a more sturdy toned voice, to let us in. I once again said no. So, they reached towards their glasses and removed them. I remembered what my friends told me, and shut the door. I ran into my bathroom, brought a blanket and hid in the bathtub until my dad got home. I don't know if this was really real, or if it was just some kids pranking me, but I still get creeped out when I hear knocks at my door.
This happened back in the 1980s, when I was between 9 and 10. I was an only child at this point, and my mother was a single mom. She had taken all the money she had and bought a trailer and some land, and moved out to the country. We lived in a rural area in East Texas on a 2-acre tract of land. Houses were sparse and situated quite far apart, so not a heavily populated area. My mom was busy with something in her room, which was situated at the far end of the 72-feet trailer we lived in. I went into the kitchen for something, and heard a knock at the door. I went to open it and found 4 kids standing outside, 2 boys and 2 girls. I opened the screen door and the larger of the boys asked, "Can we use your phone? We need to call our mom." I was immediately suspicious, because where had these kids come from? I had lived here a few years and knew all the kids in the neighborhood. I remember looking at the larger boy's eyes and thinking something was different about him, but couldn't put my finger on it. I later realized that his eyes were almost black. I shrugged and opened the screen wider and let them in. I left the front door open as I took them into the kitchen and pointed to where the phone was. The larger boy picked up the phone as my mom called to me. I ran into my mom's room and she said, "Who is in the house?" I told her a bunch of kids wanted to use the phone. She looked angry and said, "You don't let anyone in the house. Tell them to leave." I walked out of her room and back to the kitchen to tell them they had to go, and found the phone off the hook. The front door was still open and the screen door closed. I ran to the door and outside to look for the kids. They were nowhere to be found. They couldn't have even had time to walk or run across 2 acres to get to the street, so where were they? After that happened, life was super weird. Mom was always getting sick, unable to find sustainable work. She became heavily paranoid and got into damaging relationships with men. Of the most weird occurrences were when she didn't have the ability to pay the phone bill. So the phone company came and disconnected the phone. However, we were still getting phone calls. I rarely ever answered the phone. So, when Mom told me this, I was skeptical and didn't really believe her. Then one day she was busy outside and the phone rang, so I answered it. I heard a woman say hello on the other end. It sounded like my aunt, then it just all went to static. When Mom came back in, I told her what had occurred. She went to a neighbor's and called the phone company and asked them to check the line, that our phone was ringing. They came out, inspected the line at the pole and came inside and told my mom, "There is no way you are getting phone calls, the line is completely disconnected, it's cut at the pole." This happened constantly, even after Mom moved the trailer to another city. In that city she had failed to pay the bill again and the phone was disconnected. But we kept getting phone calls that ended in dead air or strange voices and static. Their linesman told her the same thing, that there was no way our phone was ringing. But yet, it did. To this day I really don't know what to make of any of that. But it was also around this time I began to experience things like words of knowledge and clarity and experiences where I would know things I had never learned. I'd hear things before they happened in physical reality. I mostly kept those experiences to myself and would just think it was weird. When Mom sold that trailer, we never had those weird phone experiences again, and the clairaudience also went away. Something had happened to that trailer after those kids had come in the door. Here are a few other experiences I remember. While still living in the country, I was sitting on Mom's bed next to her. She was saying it feels like bugs are crawling all over me. I got off the bed and walked over to her dresser and for some reason felt the need to look up. On the ceiling, there were millions of tiny spiders. This is no exaggeration. I knew my mom would freak out, so I told her, "Mom, please get up and leave this room." She looked at me with a look of concern and asked why. I said, "Please, just get out of this room." She then gave me a look like I was being impossible. So I told her, "Look up." I had never seen her leave a room so fast after she looked up and saw that mess. We fumigated the house directly after that several times a year. I have never seen anything like that before or since. After we had moved the trailer to another city, some lights would either dim or get brighter and brighter when we turned them on, until they literally popped. When Mom called the electric company, they sent an electrician out to inspect. He climbed the pole, and when he went to test one of the lines, it literally popped him off the pole and he flew to the ground. He was okay, though a little shaken. The electric company's stance on the issue was that there was a miswiring at the pole. It was most likely that they missed the ground. Again, could be unrelated, but the circuit breakers never tripped during these episodes.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.